The telegram had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had gone soft along the creases, threatening to separate into 4 quiet pieces in Eliza Voss's hands. She had read it perhaps 100 times in the 3 weeks since it arrived, as though repetition might eventually change the words printed there in the terse, economical language of the Western Union office in Abilene, Kansas. Uncle Harold passed, 14, and stop. Left you the homestead and all contents. Stop. Property located Cedar Hollow, Colorado territory. Stop. Deed held by Surveyor Office Durango. Stop. Come if you intend to keep it. Stop. It had been sent by a man named Gerald Fitch, who identified himself as her uncle's nearest neighbor, and who had added, in a handwriting that suggested he was not accustomed to the telegraph office's per-word pricing, a final line: "Hurry, stop." Eliza was 22 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had grown up in Cincinnati in a house that smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage, in rooms that were always a little too small for the number of people occupying them. Her parents were gone now, within 6 months of each other, her father to a factory accident, and her mother to the grief that followed. Her younger brother had gone west 2 years ago, and his letters had stopped arriving. She had a small room above a seamstress shop on Elm Street, a job keeping ledgers for a dry goods merchant named Partridge, and exactly $41 and some cents to her name. She had never met Uncle Harold. He was her father's estranged brother, a man who had gone west decades ago, and become, in family legend, either a failure or a romantic, depending on who was telling the story. He had written her father one letter when Eliza was 12, a letter she had found after her father's death, pressed flat between the pages of a Bible. The handwriting was slanted and strong. "The sky out here, William," she wrote. "You cannot imagine the sky." She could not afford to keep the property from Cincinnati. She could barely afford the train ticket. But the alternative, another winter in those small rooms, another year of Mr. Partridge's ledgers, the slow narrowing of a life into nothing, was something she found she could not face. She packed a single trunk, gave notice to Mr. Partridge, and bought a ticket on the Denver and Rio Grande. The mountains rose up around the train like the walls of a cathedral no human hands had built. She had pressed her face to the glass as they climbed, watching the pines thicken and the air grow luminous with altitude. By the time the conductor announced the stop for Cedar Hollow, the sky outside was the deep, burning gold of late afternoon, and the aspens along the creek were just beginning to turn, their leaves trembling silver and pale yellow in a wind she could not yet feel. The platform at Cedar Hollow was not much of a platform. It was a plank of weathered wood beside a water tower, with a hand-painted sign that had lost most of its paint to the mountain winters. There was no station building. There was no one waiting. She had written ahead to Gerald Fitch's address, informing him of her arrival date. She had received no reply. She stood beside her trunk as the train groaned and pulled away, and she listened to the silence rush in to fill the space it left. It was a silence of immense depth and quality, layered with wind in the pines and the distant sound of water over stones. It was nothing like Cincinnati. It was nothing like anything she had ever known. She waited an hour, then another. The light shifted from gold to the pale, bruised purple of high-altitude dusk, and the temperature dropped in a way that felt almost personal, as though the cold had taken a particular interest in her. She had no way of knowing how far the homestead was. She had no way of knowing if Gerald Fitch had received her letter. She had no way of knowing anything, except that she was standing alone on a plank of wood in the Colorado mountains with a trunk she could not carry, and the nearest lights she could see were perhaps half a mile down the road, a small cluster of yellow warmth in the gathering dark. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the slow creak of wheels and the patient plodding of a horse coming down the mountain road from the direction opposite the town lights. The wagon materialized out of the dusk, driven by a man who was silhouetted against the fading sky. He pulled up short when he saw her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. He climbed down from the wagon with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned that haste wasted more energy than it saved. He was not old. That was the first thing she registered. She had expected old, from the name Gerald Fitch and from the general air of telegram senders in her experience. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, lean in the way that hard work made a person lean, with the kind of face that outdoor light and outdoor hardship carved into something that was not handsome in any conventional sense, but was nonetheless impossible to look away from. He wore no hat, which surprised her, and his dark hair was disordered by the wind. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked at her with gray eyes that were direct without being unkind. "You'd be the niece," he said. It was not a question. "Eliza Voss," she confirmed. "You're Mr. Fitch?" "I am." He looked at her trunk, then at the road behind him, then back at her. "I got your letter yesterday. The post out here is irregular." He said this without apology or excuse, simply as a fact about the world she had entered. "I intended to be here when the train came. A ewe got into trouble this morning, and I couldn't leave her." She absorbed this. "Is the ewe all right?" He looked at her for just a moment with an expression she couldn't read. "She is." "Lost the lamb, though." He picked up her trunk and loaded it onto the wagon bed with practiced ease. "The homestead's 3 miles up the north road. I can take you tonight, or you can stay in town and go up in the morning." "Tonight," she said, without hesitating. She climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could offer a hand, and she thought she saw something shift briefly in his expression. Not amusement, exactly. Something quieter than that. They drove in silence for a while. The road wound up through the aspens and then through a stand of dark spruce, and the sky above the trees was turning the deep ink blue of true dusk, with the first stars beginning to press through. The cold was real and serious now. She kept her spine straight and refused to shiver. "Your uncle," Gerald Fitch said eventually, his eyes on the road. "He was a decent man." "I didn't know him," she said. "My father and he were estranged. I only knew him from one letter he wrote, years ago." He nodded, as if this were not surprising. "He talked about your father sometimes, regretted the falling out." He paused. "He left the place to you, deliberate-like. Said you were the one who had your grandmother's stubbornness. Said that would be enough." Eliza looked at the dark shapes of the mountains against the darkening sky and said nothing. She was not sure whether to be moved or unsettled by the idea of a man she had never met, placing a quiet faith in her character from a distance of 1,500 miles. The homestead appeared around a bend in the road as a low, dark shape. Gerald Fitch stopped the wagon and handed her down a lantern he lit from a match struck on the wagon board. He carried her trunk to the door and set it on the porch. "Keys under the left board, third from the door," he said. "Your uncle kept a good woodpile on the east side. Stove should draw fine." She found the key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. In the lantern light, the house resolved itself into a single large room, with a stone fireplace at one end, a kitchen area at the other, and, she noticed with a small and unexpected catch in her throat, a window above the kitchen work table that faced directly west, toward the mountains. Even in the dark, she could see the outline of the peaks through the glass. "My property is adjacent," Gerald Fitch said from the doorway, making no move to come in. "The north fence line is shared, if you need anything." He said it the way practical people said such things, as an actual offer rather than a social nicety. "I'll be over in the morning to show you where the well is." She turned to thank him. He had already gone. She heard the wagon moving back down the road, the sound fading slowly into the mountain silence. She built a fire in the stove with the wood he had mentioned, and she sat in the only chair and looked around at the life her uncle had lived in this place. His pipe was on the mantel. His boots were by the door. His Bible was open on the table to a page in the Psalms, as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and hadn't come back. She did not cry. She was not sure what she felt, only that the house, for all its plainness and all its silence, did not feel entirely empty. The morning light, through the west-facing window, brought the mountains into the kitchen in a way that stopped her where she stood, her hand still on the pump handle. The peaks were catching the first gold of sunrise along their eastern faces. The snow on the highest ridges flushed rose pink. It was a spectacle she had not been prepared for. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Gerald Fitch arrived at 7, as he had said he would, and showed her the well and the state of the kitchen garden, which had been put to bed for the coming winter, and the small barn where her uncle had kept 2 goats and a mule. The mule was still there, gray and philosophical in its opinions. "The goats I took in," he said. "I'll bring them back if you're staying." "I'm staying," she said. He looked at her once, with those direct gray eyes, and nodded. Over the following weeks, Eliza learned what it meant to manage a frontier homestead alone. She learned it in the specific, unforgiving way that the land itself taught by the blisters that rose and hardened on her palms. By the morning she woke to find the pipe from the well had frozen and had to be thawed with water heated on the stove. By the afternoon, a late September storm came off the mountains with startling speed, and she barely got the mule into the barn before the snow was horizontal. She had been good with numbers in Cincinnati. She was learning to be good with entirely different things in Cedar Hollow. Gerald Fitch appeared when she needed him, in a way that seemed almost accidental, but she gradually understood was not. He arrived the morning after the storm to check the roof, which had held, and to split additional wood for the pile, which had been depleted. He didn't announce these visits. He simply appeared, did the thing that needed doing, and left. He never stayed long. He was always back across the fence line before she had properly formulated a way to thank him. One morning in October, she arrived at the shared fence to find a large, flat stone had been placed over the muddy section of the path she used to reach her east pasture, so she could cross without ruining her boots. There was no note. There was never a note. She stood looking at the stone for a moment, and then she went back to her house and baked a pie from the dried apples she'd found in her uncle's cellar. She left it on his porch without knocking. The next morning there was a stone jar of honey on her windowsill. She had not seen him leave it. It became a kind of conversation, conducted entirely in objects and small gestures, in the spaces between words. She learned his rhythms, the early morning sounds of his work across the fence, the way his lamp burned late when a difficult berth was keeping him in the barn, the set of his shoulders when he was working against a problem. He was a man who thought with his hands, who solved things with action rather than words. She found she understood this language, even if she hadn't known it before. The trouble arrived in November, quiet and politely dressed, in the form of a man named Caldwell. He came in a good coat and a hat that had been brushed clean of trail dust, which in her experience meant he had put effort into appearing trustworthy. He introduced himself as a land agent, representing a development interest out of Denver. He was pleasant. He was well-spoken. He told her that the Cedar Hollow Valley was being looked at for railroad expansion, that the land values here would be meaningless within a year, and that he had been authorized to offer her 3 times the assessed value of the property, right now, today, for a quick and clean sale. He set a figure on the table that made her breath stop for just a moment. "You'd be well set up," he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of men who are paid to sound sincere. "A young woman alone. Out here this is no life. You could go back east. Start fresh." She kept her hands flat on the table and her expression still, the way her father had taught her to do with numbers that seemed too good to be true. "I'll need to consider it," she said. "Of course," he said, smiling. "I'll be in Cedar Hollow through the end of the week." He set a card on the table. "Don't wait too long. These offers have a natural life." After he left, she sat for a while with his card on the table. 3 times the assessed value. It was a real amount of money. It was enough money to change what her life could look like. She was not foolish enough to pretend otherwise. She went to the fence line that afternoon. Gerald Fitch was there within 10 minutes, as if some quality of the mountain air had carried her presence to him. She told him about Caldwell and the offer. She watched his face as she spoke, the stillness that came over it, the careful way he listened, the slight tightening around his jaw. "Did he show you documents?" he asked. "No." "Did he give you anything in writing about this railroad expansion?" "Only his card." He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the fence post with his forearms on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular. "There's no railroad survey through this valley," he said. "I'd have heard. The county surveyor would have been out." He looked at her then. "What he's likely doing is buying up land cheap on behalf of a land consolidation group out of Denver. They did it all through the San Juan Basin 2 years ago. Bought out farms at panic prices using false railroad talk. They're speculating on the growth of the territory. She had suspected something similar, but having it confirmed clarified the cold anger that had been sitting in her chest since Caldwell left. He was banking on the fact that I'm young and alone and wouldn't know enough to question him, she said. Gerald Fitch looked at her with a steadiness that she had come to understand was the nearest he came to expressing strong feeling. Do you want to do anything about it? Officially, I mean. I know the county sheriff. She thought about it. She thought about Caldwell's patronizing warmth, about the way he had said a young woman alone, out here, as if her aloneness were a deficiency of judgment rather than a circumstance of loss. She thought about what a formal complaint would look like, the attention, the questions, the slow machinery of official channels, and herself at the center of it all, a newcomer, an outsider, making accusations against a man in a good coat. He hasn't done anything illegal yet, she said. He made an offer. I declined it. She looked at the mountains. The snow was heavier on the high peaks now, a permanent white line above the tree line. I don't want to spend the winter being a grievance. I want to spend the winter learning to keep my pipes from freezing. Something moved in his expression, a deepening of the lines beside his eyes. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. I can show you how to wrap the pipes, he said. I know, she said. I was speaking generally. That, she thought, might have been the longest conversation they had yet had. December arrived and sealed the valley in snow. The world contracted to the distance she could travel on foot, and she found, to her surprise, that she did not find the contraction confining. She had brought books. She had her uncle's collection of seeds, catalogued in his neat handwriting and stored in labeled envelopes, which she spread across the kitchen table on the long evenings and organized for spring planting with a satisfaction that she recognized as genuine. The mountains outside her west-facing window were extraordinary in the snow, white and enormous and ancient, indifferent to her in a way she had come to find strangely comforting. Gerald Fitch was snowed in as often as she was. On the bad days, when the drifts were too high for sensible travel, she would see the smoke from his chimney through the trees and feel something that was not loneliness, exactly, but its opposite, the specific warmth of knowing that someone nearby was also warm. On a clear December afternoon, she walked to his door for the first time. She brought bread she had baked that morning, because she needed a reason, and the bread was real. He opened the door and looked at her, and then at the bread with an expression she had learned to read as the suppression of pleased surprise. His house was like its owner, plain, spare, everything in its place, scrupulously clean, but without softness. There were good tools on their hooks and a shelf of books. She noted the titles, Geography and Animal Husbandry, and 2 novels that surprised her, Dickens and George Eliot. On the mantelpiece was a small carved figure of a horse, beautifully detailed, the kind of object made by hands that could not stop working even at rest. You carved that, she said. When I was younger, he said, which she understood to mean he still did. They drank coffee. They talked about the seed catalogs, which he knew a great deal about, and about the west-facing window, which she told him about, and about her uncle, whom he described with a quiet affection that told her Harold Voss had been a better man than the family story had given him credit for. She stayed 2 hours. She walked home through the blue shadow snow with the feeling of having been, for the first time and longer than she could calculate, entirely herself in someone else's company. After that, the visits went both ways, without formality, without announcement. She brought bread or preserved plums. He brought firewood or the news from town that he collected on his supply runs, relayed in the concise manner of a man who distinguished between information and opinion. The conversations that had once been conducted in small gestures and silence now had words attached, but the quality was the same, a kind of economy and honesty that she found she had been starving for without knowing it. It was in January that she found the letter. She had been sorting through the remaining contents of her uncle's desk, a task she had been putting off because it felt like a final closing of the door on a man she had only just begun to understand. Beneath a stack of receipts and a surveyor's map of the property, She found an envelope addressed in her uncle's handwriting. It was addressed to her. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. "Eliza," he had written, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are there, which means you are braver than your father ever gave you credit for. He loved you, I think. He was just afraid of what your courage would cost you. I want you to know that I did not leave you the property only because you were the last of us. I left it to you because of a conversation I had with your neighbor, Gerald Fitch, 2 Christmases ago, when I knew my health was failing. I told him I was worried about the place. He told me to write to you. He'd heard about you from your brother, who passed through Cedar Hollow 2 years back on his way to Oregon. Gerald thought, and I came to agree, that the homestead needed someone with exactness and stubbornness in equal measure, and that you might need a place that required exactly that. I asked him what he thought you'd find if you came. He said, good soil, a hard winter, and a fair neighbor. I thought that was a reasonable set of things to offer a person. The property is yours freely. Make of it what you can. The kitchen window faces west, toward the mountains. I always found that view worth staying for. Your Uncle Harold. She read the letter twice. Then she sat for a long time in the quiet of the kitchen, her hands folded on the table, the winter light coming pale and clean through the west-facing window. Gerald Fitch had known about her. He had spoken her name to her uncle 2 years before she arrived, when she had been no more than a description, a young woman in Cincinnati who was good with numbers and stubborn enough to be worth something. He had been, in some sense. She was only now understanding the reason she was here at all. Not in the way of manipulation or arrangement, but in the way of a quiet, considered act of care for 2 people he thought might be good for each other and for the land. She thought about Caldwell, with his polished shoes and his false railroad talk, who had tried to frighten her into selling what was hers. She thought about Daniel Whitcomb and the original story she'd heard from Mrs. Gable once, over a winter evening of tea, about that poor woman who'd come west to marry a man who already had a wife, a story that had made her grip her own cup tighter and feel the full, specific weight of her own luck. She thought about Gerald Fitch, who had never said a word more than the truth, who had wrapped her pipes and set a flat stone over the mud and left honey on a windowsill and lost a night's sleep over a ewe who was in trouble, who had come when she stood at the fence line and needed him, not because she had asked him to be a certain kind of person, but because he already was. She put on her coat. He was in the barn when she came across the snow-covered field, mending a piece of harness with the focused quiet she recognized as his natural state. He looked up when she came in, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. She told him about the letter. She read him the parts about the conversation he'd had with her uncle, about her brother passing through, about the property being left to her not by accident but by a chain of small, deliberate kindnesses she was only now tracing to their source. He listened. He set down the harness and leaned against the stall door and looked at the middle distance while she read, and when she finished, the silence held for a long moment. Your uncle asked me what I thought you'd find, he said. I told him what I knew. Good soil, a hard winter. He paused. I left out the last part. She looked at him. I didn't know you then, he said. The words came the way his words always came, plain, considered, without flourish or apology. I'd only heard about you, but when you stepped off that wagon in the dark and your first question was about the ewe, he stopped. I knew then. I didn't know what to do about it, but I knew. The barn was very still. Outside, the snow was beginning again, light and quiet, sifting down through the firs. You have built a life here, he said. That's yours, what you've done. I want to be honest about that. I'm not the reason you stayed. No, she agreed. But you're the reason I knew it was possible. She held the letter in her hands. Gerald. It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed. She saw him notice. I have been in this valley 4 months, and I have not once felt that I was endured or managed or directed. I have felt, she chose the word carefully, the way she chose all important things, seen. He looked at her then, with the full weight of those gray eyes, and what was in them was something she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks without knowing what to call it. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "You know that." "I do. But I want to ask you." He stopped, started again. The words were difficult for him, and he was not going to dress that fact up. "I would like to ask you to consider whether what we have here, the fence line, the bread, the honey, all of it could become something permanent, on purpose, not by accident." He held her gaze. "I would like to ask you to marry me, Eliza. Not because you need someone to look after you. You've shown me clear as daylight that you don't. But because this valley is better with you in it, and I think I am too." The snow fell. The mule shifted his considerable weight in the corner of the barn. Somewhere on the hillside a raven called once and was silent. "My uncle said the view from the west window was worth staying for," she said. "Your uncle was a wise man," said Gerald Fitch. "He was," she said. "So are you." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain, which told her more about him than anything he had yet said. He crossed the space between them and took her hand in both of his hands that were roughened by cold and work and the 1,000 daily requirements of this life she had chosen, and held it with a carefulness that was its own kind of declaration. They were married in the Cedar Hollow Church in March, when the snow was still deep on the high ground, but the aspens in the lower valley were beginning to push out their first pale catkins. The surveyor and his wife came, and old Mrs. Prentice, who ran the general store, and a handful of ranch families from the surrounding valleys. Eliza wore a dress she had made herself from fabric, ordered out of the Sears catalog, the color of the Colorado sky an hour before sunrise. Gerald wore his good coat and looked like a man who was quietly certain he was making no mistake. 4 years after that, on a September afternoon when the aspens had turned full gold and the light lay long and sweet across the valley, Eliza was sitting on the porch, shelling the last of the summer beans into a clay bowl. Her daughter, May, 3 years old and her father's gray eyes in her mother's determined face, was arranging pine cones into careful rows on the porch steps with the focused intensity of a child who has inherited an instinct for order. Eliza's son, just turned 5 and named Harold for the uncle who had made all of this possible, was somewhere on the far side of the barn, conducting what sounded like a passionate argument with the mule. Gerald came around the corner of the house, his jacket pushed back, a smear of honest work on his hands, and sat down on the step beside May, who leaned against his knee without looking up from her pine cones. He looked at Eliza. She looked at him. "Harold's in the barn again," she said. "I heard," he said, with the particular quality of amusement he reserved for his son. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, a gesture so habitual now that neither of them fully registered it, except as a kind of grammar, a way of punctuating a sentence that had been going on for 4 years. She looked out at the mountains. The snow had returned to the high peaks, a early dusting that would melt and return a dozen times before it stayed for good. The west-facing window of the kitchen behind her caught the afternoon light and held it, warm and golden, the way good windows do. She thought, not for the first time, of her uncle's letter. "I asked him what he thought you'd find." She thought of herself standing on that half-rotten plank of a platform in the dark, believing that the cold she felt had nothing to do with the mountain air. She thought about how far she had been that night from understanding what was in front of her. A lie, Caldwell's false railroad talk, had sharpened her. A letter from a dead man had explained what she could not have understood any sooner than she did. And a man who set flat stones over muddy paths and left honey on windowsills without signing his name had built something with her, one quiet act at a time, that she would not have traded for any life she might otherwise have lived. Harold came barreling around the corner of the barn at a dead run, gap-toothed and thoroughly pleased with himself. "The mule winked at me," he announced. "Mules don't wink," his father said. "This one does," Harold said, with complete confidence, and climbed up onto the porch railing to survey his property. Eliza looked at Gerald. He looked at her. The conversation they had in that look was the kind that required no words and took no time. It was the kind that 4 years of shared mornings and shared winters and the raising of children and the keeping of land make available to 2 people if they are both paying attention. She picked up another handful of beans. The light through the mountains was extraordinary. It always was, this time of day, this time of year. She had never once taken it for granted. She had come west for a piece of land she'd never seen, left to her by a man she'd never known, and she had found something she had not known enough to look for the particular, irreplaceable rightness of a life that fits. Not because it was easy, and not because it was what she had planned, but because she had been stubborn enough to stay and honest enough to see what was in front of her. The mule, from inside the barn, made a sound of profound and settled contentment. May looked up from her pine cones. "He agrees," she said. Gerald laughed, a real laugh, the kind that reached his eyes, and the sound of it went out into the golden Colorado afternoon and was absorbed by the mountains, which had been holding the sounds of this valley for longer than anyone could remember, and which would go on doing so long after all of them were gone. The west window of the kitchen caught the last of the light as the sun dropped behind the peaks. It was not the empty house she had inherited. It was the fullest place she had ever known. Sometimes the life we were meant to live doesn't arrive on the train we were expecting. It's waiting quietly on the other side of a fence, leaving honey on windowsills and flat stones over muddy paths, hoping we're paying enough attention to notice. The kindness that changes everything rarely announces itself. It just shows up, steady and unhurried, and keeps showing up until one day you realize it's become the whole shape of your world. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, while carrying with it a small, sincere lesson about the good that quiet kindness can build.